There is a photograph taken sometime in the late 1970s. It is faded now, the colours muted by time, but the image remains as vivid as any moment captured in American sport. A tall man leans against the door of a Plymouth painted in the deepest shade of petty blue, a colour so particular to one family that it might as well have been trademarked by God himself. He is wearing his signature cowboy hat, the brim curled just so. His sunglasses catch the Carolina sun. His smile, wide and easy, belongs to a man who has just won another race, though, by this point in his career, it is difficult to keep count. Around him, a crowd presses forward, not to touch the car, not to study the engine. They are reaching for him. They want to shake his hand. They want a moment with the king. Richard Petty won 200 races in the NASCAR Cup Series. That number deserves to sit in silence for a moment. 200 victories. No other driver in the history of stock car racing has come within 60 wins of that total. It is the kind of record that does not merely stand, it looms. It casts a shadow so long and so dark that every driver who has ever strapped into a stock car since the king retired has looked up at that number and understood, deep in their bones, that they will never reach it. David Pearson, the Silver Fox, the man widely considered Petty's greatest rival, won 105 races. That is roughly half of Petty's total. Jeff Gordon, one of the most talented drivers of the modern era, won 93. Jimmy Johnson, the 7-time champion, won 83. Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, won 76. These are all extraordinary numbers. They are all dwarfed by 200. But the wins are only part of the story, perhaps the smaller part, because Richard Petty did something that no statistic can adequately capture. He became the human face of a sport that, for decades, was considered too rough, too regional, too southern, and too dangerous for mainstream America. He took stock car racing from the dirt tracks of the Carolina Piedmont to the living rooms of the entire nation. He did it not with flash or controversy or scandal, but with a handshake and a smile, with hours spent signing autographs long after the last car had been loaded onto its trailer, with a willingness to treat every single fan as though they were the most important person at the track that day. There is a reason they called him the King. It was not because he demanded the title. It was because everyone who watched him, who met him, who raced against him, understood that he carried himself with a kind of grace that went beyond talent. He was royalty in a sport of blue-collar warriors, and he wore the crown so naturally that it never seemed to weigh him down. His career spanned 35 seasons. He competed in 1,184 races. He won 7 championships, tying him with Dale Earnhardt for the most in the sport's modern era. He won the Daytona 500 an astonishing 7 times, a record that still stands and likely always will. He won 27 races in the single season of 1967, a number so absurd that it sounds like fiction. 10 of those victories came consecutively, one after another, a streak of dominance that the sport has never seen before or since. And yet, for all of those numbers, for all of those trophies and champagne bottles and victory lane celebrations, the thing that people remember most about Richard Petty is not what he did on the track. It is what he did after he climbed out of the car. It is the way he treated people, the way he lingered, the way he made time, the way he understood, without ever needing to be taught, that the relationship between a champion and the people who love him is not a one-way street. It is a conversation. And Richard Petty never stopped having that conversation, not once, in all his years in the sport. There is a story, told so often that it has become part of racing's oral tradition, about a young boy who waited in line for hours to meet the king at a race in the early 1980s. By the time the boy reached the front, most of the other drivers had long since left. Petty was still there. He signed the boy's hat. He signed his shirt. He talked to him about racing, about school, about whatever the boy wanted to talk about. When someone from Petty's team finally tapped him on the shoulder and said they needed to go, the king looked at the line of fans still waiting and shook his head. He was not leaving until every single person had gotten their moment. That was not a publicity stunt. That was not a calculated decision made by a marketing team. That was Richard Petty. That was always Richard Petty. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why 200 wins, while staggering, only begin to tell the story. You are going to understand how a quiet kid from Level Cross, North Carolina, a town so small it barely qualified as a dot on the map, became the most important figure in the history of American motorsport. You are going to understand the sacrifices he made, the pain he endured, the crashes that nearly killed him, and the losses that shaped him in ways that victories never could. You are going to understand the man behind the sunglasses and the cowboy hat, the man who laughed easily and hurt deeply, and carried the weight of a dynasty on shoulders that never seemed to tire. You are going to understand what it meant to be the king, and why that title, once given, could never be taken away. Before we get started, if you find these stories as moving as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more people who appreciate the legends of the game. Now, let us begin. To understand Richard Petty, you must first understand the culture that created him, not just the sport. The culture, because NASCAR did not emerge from a boardroom or a business plan. It grew from the red clay of the American South, from a world of church suppers and tobacco barns, and families who measured their worth not in dollars, but in the calluses on their hands. Stock car racing was not invented by wealthy men seeking entertainment. It was invented by working people who happened to love speed, and the culture they built around that love would shape every aspect of the sport for generations to come. The roots of that love stretch back further than most people realize. In the hills of Appalachia and the back roads of the Carolina Piedmont, long before anyone thought to organize a race, there were men who drove fast out of necessity. During the years of Prohibition, from 1920 to 1933, moonshiners needed to move their product from the stills hidden deep in the mountains to the customers waiting in the towns below. The roads were narrow, winding, and treacherous. The federal agents were relentless, and the only advantage a moonshine runner had was a car that had been modified to go faster than anything the government could put on the road. These were not professional drivers. They were farmers, mill workers, mechanics, and men with few other options in an economy that offered even fewer. They worked on their own engines, souped up their own suspensions, and learned to take curves at speeds that would make a modern driver's blood run cold. They drove at night, without headlights, on roads that had no guardrails and no forgiveness. If you crashed, you were on your own. If you got caught, you went to prison. And if you made it through, you started the whole process over again the next week. It was, in its way, the most honest form of motorsport ever created. There were no sponsors, no television cameras, no trophies, no prize money beyond what you could sell a jar of whiskey for. Just a man, a car, and the need to be faster than the person behind him. And when those men started gathering on weekends to race each other for bragging rights, or maybe for a small purse collected from the crowd, something powerful was born. Something that would eventually become the most popular form of racing in America. The culture that surrounded those early races was inseparable from the culture of the South itself. These were communities built on loyalty, on family, on a fierce pride in self-reliance, and a deep suspicion of outsiders. People worked hard all week in the textile mills and furniture factories that dotted the Piedmont region, and on Saturday nights, they gathered at the local dirt track to watch their neighbors race. The cars were not exotic machines imported from Europe or designed in wind tunnels. They were the same Fords and Chevrolets and Plymouths that sat in every driveway, on every street, in every small town in the South. The difference was what a skilled mechanic could do under the hood. That was the magic. That was the art. You could take an ordinary car and make it extraordinary, and in doing so, you could transform an ordinary man into a hero. This was the world that Richard Petty was born into on July 2nd, 1937, in the tiny community of Level Cross, North Carolina. The South of the late 1930s was still reeling from the Great Depression. Money was scarce. Opportunities were scarcer. The textile mills that employed much of the region's workforce paid wages that barely covered the essentials. Families relied on gardens and livestock to supplement their income. Life was hard, but it was honest, and the people who lived it did not waste time feeling sorry for themselves. Lee Petty, Richard's father, was not yet the racing legend he would become. He was a truck driver, a practical man with a sharp mind and an even sharper competitive streak. Lee Petty did not come to racing through moonshine or rebellion. He came to it because he saw an opportunity. He understood, earlier than most, that stock car racing was going to become something more than a Saturday night pastime. He understood that there was a future in it, if a man was willing to work hard enough and smart enough to seize it. When Bill France Sr. organized the meeting at the Streamline Hotel in Daytona Beach, Florida, on December the 14th, 1947, the gathering that would lead to the formal creation of NASCAR, on February the 21st, 1948, Lee Petty was paying attention. He was not at that original meeting, but he grasped its significance immediately. France's vision was to bring order to a sport that had been defined by chaos. Different promoters at different tracks ran by different rules. Purse money was unreliable. Schedules were inconsistent. Drivers never knew from one week to the next whether a race would actually happen or whether the promoter would pay them if it did. France wanted to create a unified sanctioning body, a single organization that would set the rules, maintain the schedule, and ensure that drivers and teams were treated fairly. He wanted to turn a pastime into a profession. Lee Petty recognized what that meant: structure, rules, a points system, a championship. This was not just racing anymore. This was a sport, a real sport with real stakes and real rewards. And Lee Petty intended to be one of its first great champions. The culture of the Petty family was in many ways a mirror of the culture of the South itself. Everything revolved around family. Lee and his wife Elizabeth raised their children in a modest home, and the shop where Lee built his race cars was just steps from the front door. Young Richard grew up with the sound of engines as his lullaby. He could identify the make and model of a car by its exhaust note before he could read. The garage was not a separate world. It was part of the home, part of the family, part of everything. In those days, racing was a family affair in the most literal sense. Teams were not corporate entities with hundreds of employees and sponsors paying millions of dollars for logo placement. They were fathers and sons, brothers and cousins, working together in cramped garages with limited tools and unlimited determination. The Petty operation, which would eventually become Petty Enterprises, one of the most storied names in all of motorsport, began as nothing more than Lee Petty, and whatever help he could get from his family and friends. Richard was turning wrenches alongside his father before he was a teenager. He learned about engines, not from a textbook, but from watching his father's hands, grease-stained and sure, as they worked their way through a transmission or a carburetor. The bond between father and son in that shop was forged in oil and sweat and shared purpose. Lee was not a demonstrative man. He did not heap praise on his children. He showed his love through action, through the patience he displayed when teaching Richard how to adjust a valve or read a tire gauge, through the trust he showed when he let his son work on the car that he would race the following weekend. For Richard, those hours in the shop were more valuable than any formal education could have been. He was learning the language of the machine. He was learning that every bolt, every gasket, every wire had a purpose, and that understanding those purposes was the difference between winning and losing, between finishing a race and being carried out on a stretcher. This was the culture that shaped Richard Petty, a culture of work, a culture of loyalty, a culture that believed deeply in treating people with respect, regardless of who they were or where they came from. You worked hard, you were honest, you treated people right, and when you got behind the wheel, you drove as fast as you possibly could. The fans who came to the races in those early years were the same people who lived in those communities. They were textile workers and tobacco farmers, mechanics and shopkeepers, school teachers and preachers. They brought their families. They packed coolers with fried chicken and sweet tea and deviled eggs. They sat in the stands, or more often just along the fence, and they cheered for drivers they knew by name, men who lived down the road, men who went to their church, men whose children played with their children. There was an intimacy to early NASCAR that is almost impossible to imagine in the modern era of corporate sponsorship and television contracts worth billions of dollars. That intimacy was the foundation of everything Richard Petty would build, because Petty understood, instinctively and completely, that the fans were not spectators. They were participants. They were part of the story. Without them, the cars were just machines driving in circles on hot asphalt. With them, racing became something transcendent, something communal, something that bound people together across lines of class and geography and circumstance. As the sport grew through the 1950s, it carried its working-class identity with it like a badge of honor. The tracks were rough and unforgiving. Lakewood Speedway in Atlanta was a dusty, dangerous oval carved out of the Georgia clay, surrounded by trees and power lines. The old beach road course at Daytona, where cars raced on the hard-packed sand and then turned onto the paved highway before looping back onto the beach, was a spectacle of salt spray and roaring engines. A course that tested both man and machine in ways that no modern track can replicate. Darlington Raceway, the first paved superspeedway in the South, opened in 1950, and its egg-shaped layout was so demanding that drivers called it the Lady in Black because she would punish anyone who did not treat her with absolute respect. The track's narrow racing surface and asymmetric turns meant that even the best drivers would scrape the outside wall at some point during a race, earning what became known as a Darlington stripe, a badge of honor that showed you had pushed the limits and survived. These were not gleaming modern facilities with luxury suites and air-conditioned garages. They were battlegrounds, and the men who raced on them were warriors who strapped themselves into poorly protected steel machines and hurled themselves around those tracks at speeds that would have been considered suicidal in any other context. The culture of the fans reflected the culture of the drivers. There was a toughness to it, a directness. People said what they meant and meant what they said. They booed the villains and cheered the heroes, and they expected both to give everything they had, every single lap. There was no room for pretense, no patience for arrogance. A driver earned respect the old-fashioned way, by putting his life on the line and coming out the other side. And if he won, he was expected to be gracious about it. If he lost, he was expected to be tough about it. This was not a sport for the faint of heart, either on the track or in the stands. Richard Petty absorbed all of this. He absorbed it the way a sponge absorbs water, completely and without effort. He grew up watching his father navigate this world with a combination of fierce competitiveness and quiet dignity. Lee Petty was not a warm man in public. He was reserved, almost stern, with a face that seemed carved from the same granite that formed the Carolina Hills. But he was respected, deeply and universally, because he played by the rules and he won on merit. He claimed 3 NASCAR Grand National Championships in 1954, 1958, and 1959. He won the very first Daytona 500 in 1959 in a finish so close that it took officials days to determine the winner from a photograph. Lee Petty was a giant of the sport's early years, and he set a standard that his son would spend a lifetime trying to honor and eventually surpass. The cultural bond between NASCAR and its fans was, in those years, unlike anything else in American sport. Baseball had its pastoral charm and its literary tradition. Football was gaining momentum as a television spectacle, particularly after the 1958 championship game between the Baltimore Colts and the New York Giants, a game often called the greatest ever played. Basketball was still a regional curiosity in much of the country, with the professional league struggling to fill arenas outside of a handful of major cities. But stock car racing had something that none of those sports could claim. It had the feeling of shared ownership. The fans did not watch from a distance. They were right there, close enough to feel the heat from the engines, close enough to smell the burned rubber and the exhaust fumes, close enough to lock eyes with a driver as he rolled past on the pace lap. And the drivers in turn knew their fans by face, by name, by the loyalty they showed week after week, year after year, generation after generation. This was the ecosystem that produced Richard Petty. This was the soil from which the king grew. A culture of family, of faith in hard work, of loyalty to community, of love for speed and the men who chased it. It was a culture that valued authenticity above all else. It could smell a phony from 100 yards away. It had no use for pretension or self-importance. And Richard Petty, from the very beginning, was the most authentic figure the sport had ever seen. He did not put on a persona for the cameras. He did not adopt a different voice for the press or a different manner for the corporate sponsors who would eventually come calling. He was the same man in Victory Lane that he was in the garage, the same man at a formal dinner that he was at a Saturday night dirt track, the same man with the president of a major corporation that he was with a 10-year-old kid holding out a scrap of paper for an autograph. That consistency, that genuineness, was what made him not just a great driver, but a cultural icon. He was the embodiment of everything the sports fans valued, and he carried that identity with a lightness and a joy that made people want to be around him. The southern roots of NASCAR would eventually expand, reaching audiences in the Midwest, the Northeast, the West Coast, and beyond. The sport would grow from a regional curiosity into a national phenomenon, and then into a global brand worth billions. But through all of that growth, through all of the changes and expansions and corporate partnerships and television deals, the heart of the sport remained where it had always been. In the small towns, in the family garages, in the bond between a driver and the people who believed in him, Richard Petty was the bridge between those worlds. He was the man who could race at Daytona in front of 100,000 fans and then drive home to level cross and wave to his neighbors as if nothing had changed. He was the man who met with presidents and senators and captains of industry, and then went back to the shop and got his hands dirty, alongside the same crew that had been with him for decades. He never forgot where he came from. He never pretended to be something he was not. And in a culture that prized loyalty and authenticity above all else, that made him not just the king of NASCAR, but the king of the people who loved it. The story that follows is the story of how that king was made. It is a story of speed and danger, of triumph and heartbreak, of a family legacy that stretched across generations and shaped the very identity of American motorsport. It begins in a small garage in Level Cross, North Carolina, where a young boy watched his father work on engines and dreamed of the day when he would get behind the wheel himself. It is a story that, once you know it fully, changes the way you see the sport forever. Richard Lee Petty came into the world on the 2nd day of July, 1937, in Randolph County, North Carolina. Level Cross was not a town in the traditional sense. It was a crossroads, a scattering of homes and farms and small businesses in the rolling countryside of the central Piedmont. The nearest city of any size was Greensboro, about 30 miles to the northeast, and High Point was a similar distance to the west. But those cities might as well have been 1,000 miles away for all the influence they had on daily life in Level Cross. This was its own world, quiet and self-contained, and the Petty family was at its center. Richard was the second child of Lee and Elizabeth Petty. The family was close-knit in the way that rural Southern families tended to be in that era, bound together by shared work and shared meals, and a shared understanding that the world outside your door was not always kind, and that the people inside your home were the ones you could count on, no matter what. Meals were eaten together at the same table every evening. Sundays were for church. Chores were not optional. And from the earliest age Richard could remember, there were cars. Always cars. The sound of engines was the soundtrack of his childhood, as constant and as natural as birdsong. The shop behind the Petty house was the family's second home. It was not a fancy operation. It was a cinder block building with a dirt floor and a few bare bulbs hanging from the rafters. The tools were basic. The space was cramped. But in that shop, Lee Petty performed miracles of mechanical engineering that would carry him to 3 national championships and etch the Petty name into the foundation of American motorsport. And young Richard watched it all. He was tall for his age, thin and quiet, with a disposition that masked an intense competitive fire that burned beneath the surface. He was not the loudest kid in any room. He was not the one who demanded attention or picked fights or made a spectacle of himself. But he watched everything. He absorbed everything. He had the kind of intelligence that does not announce itself, but reveals itself slowly, over time, in the quality of the work it produces. And from the time he was old enough to hold a wrench, he was in the shop, learning. The education he received in that garage was worth more than any university degree. Lee Petty was a meticulous man, precise and demanding, and he believed that races were won not on the track but in the shop, in the hours and days and weeks of preparation and fine-tuning that happened before the green flag ever waved. A car that was properly prepared would finish the race. A car that was not would break. It was that simple, and Lee tolerated no shortcuts. He taught Richard how engines worked. Not just the theory, but the feel. How to listen for a misfire in the rhythm of the pistons. How to read the color of a spark plug and know whether the fuel mixture was too rich or too lean. How to feel the vibration in a chassis and know whether a wheel was out of balance or a bearing was beginning to fail. How to look at a set of tires and know, just by the wear pattern, whether the suspension was set up correctly. These were skills that could not be taught in a classroom or learned from a book. They had to be earned through repetition, through failure, through the slow accumulation of knowledge that comes from doing the same thing 1,000 times until it becomes second nature. Richard graduated from Randleman High School in 1955. He was 18 years old, and the question of what to do with his life was not really a question at all. The answer had been decided years ago. In the shop behind the house, in the sound of his father's engine coming to life on a Saturday morning. He was going to race. It was the only thing that made sense, the only thing that felt right. He had grown up in the shadow of his father's career, had watched Lee Petty climb from a local dirt track racer to a national champion, and he wanted to follow the same path. Not because his father pushed him toward it. Lee Petty was too practical for that. He knew the dangers of the sport better than anyone, and he was not eager to see his son risk his life in the same way. But the desire was in Richard's blood. It was coded into his DNA as surely as his height or the colour of his eyes, and once that desire took hold, there was no fighting it. Richard began his NASCAR career on July the 18th, 1958, at a race in Toronto, Canada. He was 21 years old, driving a 1957 Oldsmobile convertible that was, by any reasonable standard, not a competitive race car. The race was not a major event. The field was modest, and Richard Petty's debut in the NASCAR Grand National Series, as the top division was then known, ended without fanfare. He finished sixth. It was not a victory. It was not even a particularly notable result. But it was a beginning, and for a young man who had spent his entire life preparing for this moment, a beginning was enough. His father was cautious about Richard's racing ambitions. Perhaps more cautious than Richard would have liked. Lee Petty had seen too many young drivers wreck their cars and their bodies because they did not have the patience to learn the craft. He had watched men die on the track, had carried the weight of those losses in the private spaces of his mind, and he did not want his son to become another statistic. But Lee also understood that you could not keep a Petty away from a racetrack any more than you could keep water from running downhill. Racing was the family business. It was the family identity. And once Richard made it clear that he was going to race whether his father approved or not, Lee did what any good father would do. He helped him. He gave him a car from the team stable. He gave him advice, though not always gently. And he gave him the freedom to learn on his own terms, which meant the freedom to make mistakes. The first few seasons were a struggle. Richard was fast but raw. He had the instincts of a natural driver, the ability to sense the limits of a car and push right up to the edge without going over. But he lacked the experience to know when to push and when to hold back, when to fight for position and when to settle for what the car could give him. He made mistakes. He wrecked cars that the team could barely afford to replace. He finished races covered in oil and frustration, knowing that he had the talent to win, but not yet the wisdom. But he kept coming back. Week after week, race after race, he climbed behind the wheel and went out to learn. Every lap was a lesson. Every mistake was a teacher. And slowly, gradually, the raw talent began to merge with experience. And the young man, who had been just another face in the field, began to emerge as something special. His first career victory came on February the 28th, 1960, at the Southern States Fairgrounds in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was a race on a half-mile dirt track, not a superspeedway event that would make national headlines or draw the attention of the national media. The purse was modest. The crowd was modest. The track itself was unpretentious, a dusty oval surrounded by chain-link fencing and wooden bleachers. But for Richard Petty, it was a revelation. He was 22 years old, and he had just proven to himself and to his father and to every doubter in the garage area who had wondered whether Lee Petty's boy had what it took, that he could compete at the highest level of stock car racing and emerge victorious. The taste of that first win was intoxicating, a rush of adrenaline and satisfaction and pure vindication that no other experience in life could replicate. And once he had tasted it, the hunger for more became insatiable. He wanted to win again and again and again. He wanted to win so many times that no one would ever have reason to question whether he deserved to be called a champion. The 1960s season was significant for another reason, one that would alter the trajectory of Richard's career and the entire Petty family legacy. On February the 14th of that year, during a qualifying race for the second running of the Daytona 500, Lee Petty was involved in a catastrophic accident that very nearly ended his life. His car was hit during a battle for position, went airborne, sailed over the guardrail at the end of the backstretch, and flew completely out of the speedway, landing in the parking lot beyond the outer fence. The impact was devastating. Lee suffered massive injuries, including a punctured lung, a shattered pelvis, multiple broken bones, and severe internal trauma. He was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, and for days, the family did not know if he would survive. Lee Petty survived, but the injuries were so severe that he would never truly return to competitive racing. He attempted a comeback, as men of his stubborn nature tend to do, but his body could not withstand the demands of driving a stock car at high speeds for hours at a time. The career of one of NASCAR's founding champions was effectively over. The impact of that crash on Richard cannot be overstated. In an instant, he went from being Lee Petty's son, the promising young driver who was learning the ropes under his father's guidance, to being the head of Petty Enterprises. He was 22 years old. The weight of the family legacy settled onto his shoulders with a force that few young men could have borne. The team depended on him. The crew depended on him. The family business, which relied on prize money and what modest sponsorship they could attract, depended on him. There was no one else. There was only Richard. And the truth gets heavier when you consider what that transition meant in practical terms. Richard was not just racing for himself anymore. He was racing for his father, who lay in a hospital bed and then later at home, recovering slowly, listening to the race results on a transistor radio and offering advice when he could. He was racing for the family business, which would fold if the cars stopped winning and the money stopped coming in. He was racing for the crew, the mechanics and fabricators who had put their faith and their livelihoods in the Petty name. The carefree days of a young man learning his craft at his own pace were over. Richard Petty was now a professional in every sense of the word, carrying responsibilities that would have crushed a lesser man. Through the early 1960s, Petty steadily improved. The transition from supporting player to team leader was not seamless, but it was relentless. He studied the habits of the veteran drivers, men like Junior Johnson and Ned Jarrett and Buck Baker, men who had been racing since before Richard was old enough to drive. He watched how they set up their cars. He watched how they managed traffic in the middle of the pack. He watched how they dealt with adversity, with blown engines and flat tires, and the thousand small disasters that could ruin a race. And he filed it all away, adding each observation to the growing library of knowledge that he carried in his mind. He won races with increasing frequency. He learned the art of patience, the most difficult skill for any young driver to acquire. The art of managing a long race over the course of hundreds of miles, of knowing when to charge to the front and when to hang back in the draft and let the leaders wear themselves out and burn through their tires and their engines. He developed a driving style that was simultaneously aggressive and smooth, pushing the car to its absolute limit without ever seeming reckless or out of control. He could run at the front of the pack for 500 miles and make it look effortless, as if the car were an extension of his own body, responding to his thoughts rather than his inputs. His cousin Dale Inman served as his crew chief, and the partnership between the two men would become one of the most successful in the history of the sport. Inman was a genius at car setup, at understanding how the tiniest adjustments to spring rates and tire pressures and gear ratios could transform a good car into a winning one. Together, Petty and Inman developed a working relationship built on trust, intuition, and an almost telepathic understanding of what the car needed at any given moment. In 1963, Petty won 14 races and claimed his first Grand National Championship. He was 26 years old. The kid from Level Cross, the quiet boy who used to hand his father wrenches in a cramped cinderblock shop, was now the best stock car driver in America, and he was only getting started. The following season, 1964, brought the achievement that would define the early phase of his career and cement his connection to the most famous racetrack in the sport. On February the 23rd, Richard Petty won his first Daytona 500. It was the biggest race in stock car racing, the event that every driver circled on the calendar, the race that could make or break a career. The Great American Race, as it would come to be known, and Richard Petty dominated it. He led for much of the afternoon, fending off challenges from a talented and determined field, and when he crossed the finish line first, the celebration was everything a young champion could have dreamed of. But that victory was more than personal glory. It was a generational milestone. 5 years earlier, Richard's father Lee had won the very first Daytona 500 in that impossibly close finish against Johnny Beauchamp. Now, 5 years later, his son had won the same race. Father and son, both Daytona 500 champions. The Petty name was becoming synonymous with the sport's greatest event, and that connection would only deepen in the decades to come. Petty won his second championship in 1964, cementing his status as the sport's premier driver, but it was the 1967 season that would elevate him from the realm of the merely great into the stratosphere of the truly legendary. The numbers from 1967 are almost impossible to believe, even when you state them plainly and without embellishment. Richard Petty entered 48 races that season. He won 27 of them, 27 victories in a single season. That is a winning percentage of more than 56%. He finished in the top 5 in 38 of those 48 starts. He finished in the top 10 in 40 of them. He led over 10,000 laps during the course of the year, and most astonishingly of all, he won 10 consecutive races between August the 12th and October the 1st, a streak of dominance that remains the longest in NASCAR history, and that, given the nature of modern competition, will almost certainly never be matched. To put those numbers in perspective, consider that the modern NASCAR season typically features between 36 and 38 races. A driver who wins 5 or 6 of those races is considered to have had an excellent year. A driver who wins 10 would be considered to have had a historic, generational season. Richard Petty won 27 races in a season that had 48 events. He won more races in that single year than most Hall of Fame drivers win in their entire careers. The car that carried him to those victories was the number 43 Plymouth, painted in Petty blue, that distinctive shade of light blue that had become the family's trademark. The origin of that colour has been told and retold so many times that the details have blurred slightly with each retelling, but the most common version holds that it came about because Lee Petty mixed White House paint with a small amount of dark blue to create a distinctive shade that would be easy for fans and spotters to identify on the track. Whatever the precise origin, the result was unmistakable. Petty blue became one of the most recognizable colors in all of American sport. When fans saw that shade of blue flying around the track, they knew exactly who was behind the wheel. They did not need to see a number or read a name. The color told them everything. Richard's third championship came in that dominant 1967 season. He added a fourth in 1971 and a fifth in 1974. By the mid-1970s, he was already being called the King, a title that seemed to materialize organically from the collective consciousness of the sports fans and media. No committee bestowed it, no ceremony marked its arrival. One day, people simply started calling Richard Petty the King, and the name fit so perfectly, so naturally, that it seemed as though it had always been his. Because here is what separated Richard Petty from every other driver of his era, and perhaps from every driver in the history of the sport. He understood that racing was not just about what happened between the green flag and the checkered flag. It was about the relationship between the driver and the people who showed up to watch him race. And he cultivated that relationship with a dedication that bordered on devotion. After every race, win or lose, Petty would make himself available to the fans. Not for a few minutes, not for a quick wave and a walk to his hauler. He would sign autographs until his hand cramped and his fingers ached. He would pose for photographs with anyone who asked. He would talk to children about their dreams and to old men about their memories. He would listen to people's stories about where they were when he won a particular race, or how they had driven hundreds of miles to see him in person. He never turned anyone away. He never rushed through the line. He never looked at his watch or glanced at the exit. He gave each person his full attention, even if it meant staying at the track for hours after the last engine had fallen silent. This was not a marketing strategy designed by a public relations firm. This was not something his sponsors instructed him to do. This was who Richard Petty was, at his core. He genuinely liked people. He genuinely enjoyed meeting the men and women and children who supported him. And he understood, at a level that most athletes never reach, that his success was not something he had achieved alone. It belonged to everyone who cheered for the number 43 car. It belonged to the mechanic who woke up at 4 in the morning to make sure the engine was ready. It belonged to the grandmother who listened to the race on the radio while she cooked Sunday dinner. It belonged to the boy who pinned a picture of the Petty blue Plymouth to his bedroom wall and dreamed of growing up to be just like the king. His image became iconic during these years, the visual shorthand for everything the sport represented. The cowboy hat, which he began wearing in the late 1960s after a hair transplant procedure, left him self-conscious about his appearance for a time. What started as a practical decision became a signature. The hat was always there, tilted at just the right angle, whether Petty was standing in victory lane or walking through the pits or sitting in a television studio being interviewed by a network anchor who had never been to a race in his life. The ever-present sunglasses, dark and reflective, which became as much a part of his identity as the number on his car. Together, the hat and the sunglasses created an image so distinctive, so immediately recognizable, that Petty could be identified from 100 yards away, even in a crowd of thousands. The tall, lean frame that made him look more like a Western movie star than a stock car driver only added to the mystique. At 6 feet 2 inches, Petty towered over many of his contemporaries in the garage area. He moved with an easy, unhurried grace that suggested a man completely at peace with himself and his place in the world. The easy, genuine smile that lit up every photograph and every television screen was not the practiced grin of a celebrity who had been coached by handlers. It was the natural expression of a man who found joy in what he did and in the people he did it with. Richard Petty did not look like other race car drivers of his era. Many of them were shorter, stockier men with the build of wrestlers or mechanics, which many of them were. Petty looked like a man who had been cast by Hollywood to play the role of the greatest stock car driver who ever lived. And yet there was nothing artificial about him. The hat and the sunglasses were not costumes or affectations designed to create a public persona. They were simply Richard Petty, being Richard Petty, the same man at the track that he was at home. And that authenticity was what made the image so powerful and so enduring. His 6th championship came in 1975 after a season of fierce competition with drivers like Cale Yarborough and David Pearson and the emerging Darrell Waltrip, a young, brash Tennessean who was beginning to make his presence felt in the sport. The competition during the 1970s was among the fiercest in NASCAR history. The era produced a collection of talent that would be difficult to match in any decade. Bobby Allison, Buddy Baker, Benny Parsons, AJ Foyt, who crossed over from open-wheel racing to compete in select stock car events. The field was deep, and the racing was brutal, and the fact that Petty won 3 championships during this decade speaks to his extraordinary consistency and his ability to elevate his performance when the stakes were highest. His 7th and final championship came in 1979, a year that was significant for the sport, in a way that transcended any individual championship. But before we reach that pivotal moment, it is worth pausing to consider another aspect of Petty's career that helped shape modern NASCAR as we know it and that was his relationship with the STP Corporation. In 1972, STP, a company that manufactured oil treatment products and automotive additives, entered into a sponsorship agreement with Petty Enterprises that would become one of the most iconic brand partnerships in the history of sport. The STP logo, rendered in bold red and white, was plastered on the number 43 car alongside the traditional Petty blue. The combination of Petty blue and STP red became one of the most recognizable color schemes in all of motorsport. It was a visual marriage that lasted for decades, and it represented a fundamental shift in how the sport was financed. Before the era of major corporate sponsorship, racing teams survived on a combination of prize money, manufacturer support, and whatever personal resources the team owner could scrape together. It was a precarious existence, and many talented teams folded simply because they ran out of money. The STP deal showed that a consumer brand could invest in racing and receive a massive return in terms of visibility and customer loyalty. Petty's fame, his accessibility, his image as the wholesome face of a tough sport made him the perfect corporate partner. When Richard Petty endorsed STP, people bought STP. It was that simple. The partnership also demonstrated something important about Petty's character. He did not simply lend his name to a product and cash the check. He genuinely used the product. He genuinely believed in it. And when he talked about it in interviews or at personal appearances, his sincerity was evident. This was not an actor reading a script. This was a man recommending something he trusted. And the fans, who could detect insincerity the way a bloodhound detects a scent, believed him. The 1979 Daytona 500 was the first 500-mile race to be broadcast live, start to finish, on national network television. CBS carried the race, and the timing was nothing short of providential. A massive snowstorm had blanketed the eastern United States that February day, trapping millions of Americans in their homes with nothing to do but watch whatever was on television. What they saw was one of the most dramatic finishes in the history of sport, as Cale Yarborough and Donnie Allison crashed while fighting for the lead on the final lap, then climbed out of their cars and got into a fistfight in the infield grass. And while all of that chaos unfolded, Richard Petty, who had been running in third place, calmly drove past the wreckage and crossed the finish line first. It was a moment that changed everything. The television ratings were enormous, far beyond what anyone at CBS or NASCAR had expected. People who had never watched a stock car race in their lives saw the drama, the speed, the personalities, the raw human emotion of it all, and they were captivated. And the man who won the race, the man whose face appeared on every newspaper and every television broadcast the next morning, was Richard Petty, the king, the perfect ambassador for a sport that was about to explode into the American mainstream. The 10 consecutive victories of 1967 deserve particular attention, because a winning streak of that magnitude is almost impossible to achieve in any sport, let alone one as inherently unpredictable as stock car racing. In a given race, 100 things can go wrong that have nothing to do with the skill of the driver. A tire can blow, an engine can fail, a lug nut can work itself loose. Another driver can make a mistake and take you out of the race through no fault of your own. The variables are endless, and the margin between victory and disaster is measured in fractions of seconds and fractions of inches. To win one race requires skill. To win 2 in a row requires skill and fortune. To win 10 consecutive races requires something that defies rational explanation. It requires a level of excellence so complete, so sustained, so absolute, that it borders on the supernatural. During that streak, Petty and his team operated at a level of perfection that may never be seen again. Dale Inman prepared the car with obsessive attention to detail, ensuring that every component was functioning at its peak. The engine builders at Petty Enterprises crafted power plants that were both powerful and reliable, a combination that was difficult to achieve in that era of mechanical fragility. And Petty himself drove with a fluidity and a confidence that left the rest of the field in a state of bewildered admiration. He was not just winning races, he was winning them in a way that made the competition look helpless. The 1967 season also highlighted one of the most important but least discussed aspects of Richard Petty's career: which was his ability to manage a race. Stock car races are long. A typical 500-mile event lasts 3 to 4 hours. A driver cannot simply go flat out from start to finish. The tyres will not last. The engine will not last. The driver himself will not last. The art of racing, particularly in the era when Petty competed, was the art of conservation, knowing when to push, knowing when to back off, knowing when to draft behind another car to save fuel and reduce engine strain, knowing when to pit and when to stay out. Petty mastered this art earlier and more completely than any of his contemporaries. He had a gift for reading a race the way a chess master reads a board, seeing not just the immediate position, but the moves that would unfold over the next 20, 50, or 100 laps. He could sense when another driver was pushing too hard and would soon have to back off. He could feel when his own tyres were beginning to lose grip and adjust his line through the corners accordingly. He could look at the sky and judge whether rain was coming and factor that into his strategy. These were not skills that could be quantified or measured. They were the product of thousands of hours behind the wheel, of a mind that was constantly processing information and making calculations that no computer of that era could have matched. Petty's rivalry with David Pearson during these years was one of the greatest in the history of motorsport. Pearson, known as the Silver Fox for his silver hair and his cunning tactical mind, was perhaps the only driver of the era who could match Petty's raw talent. The two men raced against each other hundreds of times, and their battles were the stuff of legend. Pearson's career total of 105 victories is the second highest in NASCAR history, and many of those wins came in direct competition with Petty. Their rivalry was fierce but respectful, each man pushing the other to be better, faster, smarter. They were the Ali and Frazier of stock car racing, two titans who elevated each other and the sport through the intensity of their competition. There was also the matter of the Plymouth and Dodge brands that Petty drove for much of his career. In the 1960s, the American automobile manufacturers were deeply invested in stock car racing, using it as a way to promote their products to the car-buying public. The philosophy was simple and direct: win on Sunday, sell on Monday. Chrysler Corporation, which produced both Plymouth and Dodge, saw Richard Petty as their ultimate weapon in the showroom wars. His victories in Plymouth and Dodge vehicles drove sales in ways that no advertising campaign could match. When Richard Petty won a race in a Plymouth, every good old boy in the South who was thinking about buying a new car was a little more likely to walk into a Plymouth dealership the following week. This relationship between racing and commerce was fundamental to the economics of the sport. Without the support of the manufacturers, teams like Petty Enterprises could not have survived. The cost of building and maintaining competitive race cars was enormous, far more than prize money alone could cover. Manufacturer support provided the financial lifeline that kept the teams running, and in return, the teams provided the manufacturers with a marketing platform that reached millions of passionate, loyal customers. But the relationship was not without its tensions. In 1965, NASCAR implemented a rule change that effectively banned the Chrysler Hemi engine, a power plant that had given Petty and other Chrysler drivers a significant competitive advantage. Petty, furious at what he saw as an unfair decision, boycotted the entire 1965 NASCAR season. It was one of the few times in his career that he took a public stand against the governing body of the sport. During the boycott, he briefly competed in drag racing, of all things, winning events in his Barracuda before returning to NASCAR in 1966, after the rules dispute was resolved. That boycott revealed a side of Richard Petty that the public rarely saw. Beneath the smile and the easy manner was a man of deep conviction, who was willing to walk away from the thing he loved most in the world if he believed the principle was worth fighting for. He was not a pushover. He was not a yes man. He had steel in his spine, even if he preferred to keep it hidden beneath a layer of Southern charm. The championships continued to accumulate through the 1970s. Petty won his fourth title in 1971, driving a Plymouth that was, by this point, as famous as its driver. He won his fifth in 1974, his sixth in 1975, and his seventh and final championship in 1979. Each of those titles represented a season of sustained excellence, of week after week competition, against the best drivers in the world, of mechanical preparation and strategic brilliance and raw physical endurance. By the end of the 1970s, Richard Petty had assembled a resume that was, by any measure, the most impressive in the history of stock car racing. 7 championships, over 190 victories, 7 Daytona 500 wins, a winning streak that would never be equaled, a reputation as the most accessible and beloved athlete in American motorsport. He had achieved everything a driver could achieve. He had broken every record that mattered. He had earned every honor that existed. And somehow, at age 42, he was still going, still competing, still strapping himself into the number 43 car every weekend, and driving with the same fire that had burned in him since boyhood. The sport itself had been fundamentally altered by the 1979 Daytona broadcast. Television contracts grew larger. Sponsorship money poured into the sport from companies that had never before associated themselves with stock car racing. New tracks were built in markets that had never had a NASCAR presence. The fan base expanded beyond the traditional southern strongholds into new territory, reaching audiences in the Midwest, the Northeast, and the West Coast. And through it all, Richard Petty remained the constant, the touchstone, the name that people who were still learning about the sport could latch onto and trust. He was the welcome mat at the front door of NASCAR, and he never stopped inviting people in. But here is what makes this story unforgettable. The 1980s, the final full decade of his career, would test Richard Petty in ways that no championship season ever could. The sport was changing around him with breathtaking speed. The competition was intensifying, with a new generation of drivers who had grown up idolizing the king and now wanted nothing more than to dethrone him. And the body that had carried him through more than 2 decades of high-speed combat was beginning, slowly but unmistakably, to show the accumulated wear of a lifetime spent at the wheel of a stock car. The career of Richard Petty was not a single story with a neat beginning, middle, and end. It was a collection of moments, each one building on the last, each one adding another layer to the legend. Some of those moments were triumphant, bathed in the golden light of victory lane. Some were devastating, marked by the acrid smell of burning rubber and the sickening crunch of metal against concrete. All of them were essential. To understand the king, you must often understand the moments that made him. And to understand those moments, you must be willing to look at them clearly, without the filter of nostalgia, and see them for what they truly were. The first of these defining moments came on February the 23rd, 1964, the day Richard Petty won his first Daytona 500. He was 26 years old. He had been racing professionally for 6 seasons, steadily building his reputation and his skills. He had won races before, including his first championship the previous year, but he had never won the big one, never won the race that every stock car driver dreamed about from the time they first turned a steering wheel. The Daytona 500 was the crown jewel of NASCAR. It was the race that could transform a good driver into a great one, a great driver into a legend. And in 1964, Richard Petty made it his. The race was held at Daytona International Speedway, the massive 2.5-mile superspeedway that Bill France Sr. had built in 1959 to replace the old Beach Road course. The track was enormous. Its high-banked turns, tilted at 31 degrees, allowed cars to reach speeds that were unlike anything in American motorsport. The backstretch seemed to stretch to the horizon. The tri-oval, where the start-finish line was located, was wide enough to accommodate 5 or 6 cars running side by side. It was a cathedral of speed, and it demanded respect from every driver who entered it. Petty qualified well and ran near the front for much of the afternoon, showing the patience and the tactical awareness that would become his trademark. He did not charge to the front on the opening lap and try to lead every circuit. He saved his car, he saved his tires. He stayed within striking distance, watching the leaders, waiting for the right moment. And in the closing laps, when the cars ahead of him began to falter, when their tires began to lose grip, and their engines began to show the strain of 500 miles at full throttle, Petty pounced. He moved to the front and drove away, crossing the finish line with a margin that left no doubt about who was the strongest driver that day. The victory was more than personal. It was generational. 5 years earlier, Richard's father Lee had won the inaugural Daytona 500 in one of the most controversial finishes in racing history. The race ended in a near-dead heat between Lee Petty and Johnny Beauchamp, and it took officials 3 days of studying photographs and newsreel footage to determine that Lee was the winner. Now, 5 years later, his son had claimed the same prize. The Petty name and the Daytona 500 were becoming intertwined in a way that would only deepen with the passing decades. But beyond the family legacy, the 1964 Daytona 500 victory was the moment when Richard Petty stepped out of his father's shadow for good. Lee Petty had been a great driver. Richard Petty was going to be something more. He was going to be the greatest. And the win at Daytona in 1964 was the first major signpost on that journey. The second defining moment was the entire 1967 season, a year of dominance so complete, so overwhelming, that it remains the standard against which all other great seasons in NASCAR history are measured. The numbers have been stated before, but they bear repeating because their magnitude only grows with repetition. 27 victories in 48 starts, a winning percentage of over 56%, 10 consecutive wins, more than 10,000 laps led, a third championship to add to the 2 he had already won. These are not the statistics of a great driver having a good year. These are the statistics of a force of nature. The numbers are striking. During the 10-race winning streak alone, Petty demonstrated a mastery of the craft that defied explanation. He won on short tracks like Bowman Gray Stadium in Winston-Salem, where the racing surface was barely wide enough for 2 cars to run side by side. He won on superspeedways like Daytona, where the speeds approached 200 miles per hour and the slightest miscalculation could be fatal. He won on dirt tracks and paved tracks, on flat tracks and banked tracks, in the oppressive heat of August and the cooling temperatures of early autumn. He won with dominant performances where he led from start to finish, and he won in tight contested battles where the outcome was in doubt until the final lap. His crew chief, Dale Inman, prepared the car for each race with a precision that bordered on artistry. Every spring rate was calculated, every shock absorber was tuned, every gear ratio was selected to match the specific demands of each track. The engine builders at Petty Enterprises produced power plants that were not only fast but reliable, a combination that was extraordinarily difficult to achieve in an era when mechanical failures were as common as rainstorms in spring. And Petty himself drove with a combination of aggression and intelligence that made the rest of the field look as though they were competing in a different race. But 1967 was not without its costs. The grueling schedule, which in that era included far more races per season than the modern calendar allows, took a toll on Petty's body and his equipment. He finished several races nursing mechanical problems, nursing injuries that he never mentioned to the press, nursing a weariness that accumulated week after week and that no amount of sleep could fully erase. The cars of that era had no power steering, which meant that muscling a 3,500-pound stock car around a track for 4 or 5 hours was an act of raw physical endurance. There was no air conditioning in the cockpit. Temperatures inside the car could reach well over 130 degrees on a hot summer day. The vibration from the engine and the track surface rattled a driver's bones and blurred his vision. It was brutal, punishing work, and Petty endured it 48 times that season. The third defining moment came not on a day of celebration, but on a day of terror. Throughout his career, Petty was involved in numerous crashes, some minor and some catastrophic. The inherent danger of stock car racing in that era cannot be overstated. The cars were fast and heavy, but offered almost nothing in the way of driver protection. The roll cage was a frame of steel tubing designed more to maintain the car's structural integrity than to protect the driver inside. The seat was a thin shell of molded fiberglass or aluminum, bolted to the floor with minimal padding between the driver and the metal. The restraint system was a simple lap belt for much of the early years, eventually upgraded to a 5-point harness that held the driver's torso in place, but did nothing to protect the head and neck. There were no hands devices, the head and neck support systems that would later become mandatory to prevent basilar skull fractures. There were no energy-absorbing barriers known as safer barriers, to cushion the impact of a car striking the concrete retaining wall at full speed. There were no crush zones built into the car's structure, no deliberately engineered deformation areas designed to absorb energy and protect the driver's survival space. When a car hit the wall at 170 miles per hour, the full force of that impact was transmitted directly into the driver's body. During the course of his career, Petty suffered injuries that would have ended the careers of most men. He broke bones. He suffered concussions in an era when no one fully understood what concussions were or how dangerous repeated head trauma could be. He endured burns from hot oil and coolant that leaked into the cockpit during crashes. He dealt with chronic pain in his back, his neck, his shoulders, pain that accumulated over thousands of miles of racing on unforgiving tracks in cars that offered no suspension from the constant vibration and jarring impacts of competition. On May the 9th, 1970, at Darlington Raceway, the Lady in Black, Petty was involved in one of the most violent crashes of his career to that point. His car was struck from behind while racing at high speed on the narrow, treacherous track. The impact sent his Plymouth spinning wildly, and it struck the outside wall with tremendous force. The car rolled several times, shedding sheet metal and debris across the racing surface, before finally coming to rest in the infield. Petty was pulled from the wreckage with a dislocated shoulder, broken bones, and other injuries that, while not life-threatening, were painful reminders of what could happen on any given race day at any given track. He returned to racing as soon as his body would allow, because that is what drivers did in that era. There were no concussion protocols. There were no mandatory recovery periods mandated by the sanctioning body. If you could get in the car and turn the steering wheel, you raced. The culture of the sport demanded toughness, and Petty, for all of his warmth and gentleness off the track, was as tough as any man who ever strapped into a stock car. But Darlington was not the crash that would become the most iconic image of danger in his career. That distinction belongs to the terrifying incident at Daytona International Speedway during the 1988 Daytona 500 on February the 14th. Petty's car was launched into the air after contact with another vehicle in the tri-oval area. What followed was one of the most violent wrecks ever captured on television. The car tumbled, end over end, rolling and disintegrating as it cartwheeled through the grass and back across the racing surface. Pieces of the car flew off in every direction. The body panels peeled away like paper. When the car finally came to a stop, it was barely recognizable as an automobile. It was a twisted mass of tubing and metal, and the idea that anyone could have survived inside it seemed impossible. But Petty did survive. He was taken to the hospital, examined, and released with injuries that were, given the severity of the crash, almost miraculously minor. The crash was replayed hundreds of times on television, and it became one of the defining images of both Petty's career and the broader conversation about safety in motorsport. Every time the footage aired, it reminded viewers of the fundamental reality of stock car racing. These men were not playing a game, they were risking their lives. Every single time they climbed behind the wheel, they were accepting the possibility that this race could be their last. The fourth defining moment was the 1979 Daytona 500, the race that did more to change the trajectory of NASCAR than any single event in the sport's history. The details of that race have already been described, but the magnitude of its impact is worth exploring further. Before that February afternoon, NASCAR was known primarily in the South and in scattered pockets of enthusiasm across the rest of the country. After that afternoon, it was a national sport. The brawl between Cale Yarborough and the Allison brothers was the hook, the dramatic moment that drew people in. But it was the racing itself, the speed and the noise, and the spectacle of 43 cars thundering around the track at nearly 200 miles per hour that kept them watching. And it was Richard Petty, the calm, smiling man in the cowboy hat who won the race, who gave them a reason to come back. But before we reach that moment, there is another confrontation at Daytona that deserves its own space in the telling. The 1976 Daytona 500 featured what many historians consider the greatest finish in the history of the race, and it involved Richard Petty and his eternal rival, David Pearson. On the final lap, Petty led Pearson down the back stretch. The two cars were so close that a blanket could have covered them both. As they entered the final turn, Pearson pulled alongside Petty on the outside. The two cars made contact. They spun together, both sliding toward the infield grass, both losing control of their machines in the most important moment of the most important race of the year. Both cars came to a near stop on the grass just short of the finish line. The crowd was in disbelief. Two of the greatest drivers in history, tangled together, within sight of the checkered flag, neither able to cross the line under power. Pearson, with the presence of mind that earned him the nickname the Silver Fox, managed to coax his battered car back onto the track and across the finish line at a crawl. Petty's car would not restart. He finished second. It was a heartbreaking loss, one of the most painful of Petty's career, but it was also one of the most thrilling moments in the history of motorsport, and it captured something essential about the rivalry between Petty and Pearson. They pushed each other to the absolute limit. They brought out the best and the worst in each other. They gave the fans races that would be talked about for generations, and they did it with a respect for each other that never wavered, even in the heat of battle. After the 1976 Daytona 500, Petty congratulated Pearson on the victory. There was no bitterness, no recrimination, just the acknowledgement of one champion by another that on this day the other man had been slightly better. That was the kind of rivalry that elevated a sport, and it was the kind of sportsmanship that made Richard Petty the man he was. The impact of the 1979 broadcast rippled through the sport for years. Track owners who had struggled to fill their grandstands suddenly found themselves with waiting lists for tickets. Corporate sponsors who had never considered motorsport as a marketing platform began writing checks. Television executives who had treated NASCAR as a niche product began scheduling more races for national broadcast. The sport's revenue grew, its visibility grew, its cultural footprint grew, and at the center of it all, the man who was most responsible for giving NASCAR a friendly, accessible face was Richard Petty. He became the sport's foremost ambassador at precisely the moment when the sport needed one most. The fifth and perhaps most emotionally resonant defining moment of Richard Petty's career was his 200th and final victory, which came on July the 4th, 1984, at the Daytona International Speedway. It was the Firecracker 400, a race held on America's Independence Day, and the convergence of circumstances that surrounded this victory was so perfect, so poetic, that no screenwriter could have invented it. By 1984, Petty was 46 years old. His dominance had faded. The last several seasons had been difficult ones, with victories becoming increasingly rare. In 1981, he had won only 3 races. In 1982, he did not visit victory lane a single time, the first winless season of his career. In 1983, he won 3 times, a decent season by most standards, but a pale shadow of the years when he won 20 or more. The cars had changed, the technology had changed, the competition had changed. Younger drivers with newer equipment and bigger budgets were pushing Petty further and further from the front of the field. Many people in the garage area quietly wondered whether the king would ever win again. Some openly suggested that it might be time for him to retire, to preserve his dignity and his legacy, rather than continue to compete in a sport that was passing him by. But Richard Petty had never been a man who listened to the opinions of people who told him what he could not do. And on that 4th of July, under the scorching Florida sun, with the grandstands packed and the flags waving and the smell of barbecue drifting through the infield, Petty found something within himself that he thought might have been gone. Maybe it was the track. Daytona had always been his place, the stage on which he performed his greatest acts. Maybe it was the car, which his crew had prepared with an extra measure of care and attention, sensing that this race might be special. Maybe it was the date, the 4th of July, the most American of holidays, a day that seemed to demand something heroic. Or maybe it was simply the will of a champion who refused, absolutely and categorically refused, to accept that his time was over. The race came down to a furious, heart-pounding battle between Petty and Cale Yarborough in the closing laps. These were 2 old warriors, 2 men who had been racing against each other for decades, Two men who knew each other's tendencies and strategies, as well as they knew their own. They dueled side by side through the final circuits, trading the lead back and forth, neither man willing to give an inch. The crowd was on its feet. The television cameras were locked on the two cars as they roared down the backstretch and into the high-banked turns, separated by inches at speeds approaching 190 miles per hour. On the final lap, Petty made his move. He pulled alongside Yarborough on the high side of the track, using every ounce of power his engine could produce, and he gained just enough of an advantage to cross the finish line first by a fraction of a second, 200. The milestone that had seemed so far away just a few years earlier was suddenly, gloriously real. And then the celebration took a turn that elevated the moment from sporting achievement to cultural event. The President of the United States, Ronald Reagan, was in attendance that day, making it the first time a sitting president had attended a NASCAR race. Reagan visited Petty in Victory Lane, and the image of the king and the president standing together, both smiling broadly, the American flag waving in the background, was broadcast around the world. It was a quintessentially American moment, the kind of scene that seemed to capture everything that people loved about the country and its sporting traditions. But there was complexity beneath the celebration. After the race, during a routine post-race technical inspection, officials discovered that the engine in Petty's car was larger than the regulations allowed. The specific displacement exceeded the limit set by NASCAR's rules. The team was penalized, fined a significant amount of money and docked points in the championship standings. But the victory itself was not taken away. The 200th win stood. The engine controversy cast a brief but uncomfortable shadow over what should have been an unblemished moment. Petty himself did not address the specifics in detail, and his team maintained that any irregularity was unintentional, a consequence of the tolerances involved in building a racing engine by hand. The debate over whether the engine was deliberately oversized or simply the result of manufacturing variance has never been fully settled. But the incident served as a reminder that even the king was not immune to the grey areas and the competitive pressures that have always existed in the sport. Winning at the highest level requires pushing the boundaries, and sometimes those boundaries get pushed further than the rules allow. The years that followed win number 200 were, in many ways, the most difficult and the most revealing of Petty's career. The victories simply stopped coming. After the Firecracker 400 in 1984, Richard Petty never won another Cup Series race. He competed for 8 more full seasons, entering hundreds of races, and not once did he cross the finish line first. For a man who had won 200 races, for a man who had once won 27 in a single season, the drought was agonizing. Each Sunday brought a fresh reminder that the years were taking what they always take, that the reflexes were half a beat slower, that the eyes were half a shade less sharp, that the body could no longer endure the punishment it had once shrugged off. The sport was evolving at a pace that made it increasingly difficult for a team like Petty Enterprises, which still operated with the lean, family-based model of an earlier era, to compete. The mega teams were emerging. Junior Johnson had merged his operation with Warner Hodgdon's money. Rick Hendrick was building a multi-car juggernaut that would come to dominate the sport. Robert Yates was producing some of the fastest engines the sport had ever seen. The budgets were getting bigger. The technology was getting more sophisticated. Computer modeling and wind tunnel testing were replacing the seat-of-the-pants engineering that had carried the Pettys through 3 decades of competition. The world had changed, and it had changed in ways that did not favour the old guard. But Petty refused to quit. He was not racing for wins anymore. He was not racing for championships or for records or for the approval of critics who thought he should have retired years earlier. He was racing because racing was who he was. It was woven into the fibres of his identity, inseparable from his sense of self. To stop racing would have been to stop being Richard Petty, and that was something he could not bring himself to do. Not yet, not until the time felt right. And so he kept showing up, he kept strapping into the car, he kept making laps, he kept signing autographs after the race, even when the results gave him every reason to walk straight to his hauler and close the door. The 1980s and early 90s saw the rise of a new generation of drivers who would dominate the sport for years to come. Dale Earnhardt, the Intimidator, the man in the black number 3 Chevrolet, brought a ferocious, take-no-prisoners approach to racing that thrilled fans and terrified competitors in equal measure. Earnhardt drove with an aggression that was sometimes controversial, bumping and nudging, and forcing his way past rivals with a physicality that pushed the boundaries of the rules. Darrell Waltrip, the brash, outspoken Tennessean, who had rubbed many in the traditional NASCAR establishment the wrong way with his confident manner and his sharp tongue, won 3 championships and earned grudging respect even from those who wished he would stop talking. Bill Elliott, the red-haired Georgian known as Awesome Bill from Dawsonville, captured the nation's imagination in 1985 with his record-breaking speeds and his Winston Million bonus for winning 3 of the sport's 4 major races. Tim Richmond, the handsome, charismatic driver from Ashland, Ohio, brought a touch of Hollywood glamour and youthful energy to the sport before his life was cut tragically short by illness. Rusty Wallace, Mark Martin, Jeff Bodine, Terry Labonte. The roster of talent was deep and ferocious, and the competition was more intense than it had ever been. Petty competed against all of these men, and while he could no longer match them on the track, he maintained his dignity and his composure in a way that only deepened the respect of the racing community. He did not complain about the results. He did not make excuses. He did not point fingers at his crew or his equipment or the rulebook. He showed up, he strapped in, he drove as hard as the car would allow him to drive, and when the checkered flag fell, he climbed out and signed autographs and shook hands and posed for photographs, exactly as he had done when he was winning 27 races a year. The grace with which he handled the declining years of his career was, in its way, as impressive and as revealing of his character as any of his 200 victories. In 1992, Petty announced that the upcoming season would be his last behind the wheel. He called it the Fan Appreciation Tour, a name that captured his philosophy perfectly. It was not the Richard Petty Farewell Tour. It was not the King's Last Ride. It was the Fan Appreciation Tour. Because even in his final season, even in the last chapter of a career that had spanned 35 years, Richard Petty was still thinking about the fans first. He wanted his final season to be a thank you, a chance to visit every track on the schedule one last time and express his gratitude to the people who had supported him through thick and thin, through championships and crashes, through glory days and lean years. The response was overwhelming. At every track on the 1992 schedule, fans turned out in numbers that exceeded anything the promoters had expected. They brought signs that read "Thank you King" and "Petty Blue Forever." They wore number 43 shirts and hats and jackets that they had kept in their closets for decades, pulling them out one last time for this occasion. They stood in lines that stretched for hundreds of yards, waiting patiently in the heat and the rain and the cold for one last chance to shake the King's hand. Old men brought their sons brought their children. 3 generations of fans, connected by their love for one man and the sport he represented, gathered to say goodbye. His final race came on November the 15th, 1992, at the Hooters 500 at Atlanta Motor Speedway. It was the last event on the schedule, and it was the final page of the final chapter. The entire weekend was suffused with emotion, from the pre-race ceremonies to the moments of quiet reflection in the garage area. The race itself did not provide a storybook ending. On lap 94, Petty was involved in a crash. His car struck the wall and caught fire, sending a plume of flame and smoke into the cool Georgia sky. For a terrible, breathless moment, the crowd fell silent, fearing the worst. But Petty climbed out of the burning car under his own power, uninjured but visibly shaken. He finished the race in 35th place, many laps behind the winner. It was not the ending that anyone had dreamed of, but in a way, it was honest. It was real. It was the truth of what stock car racing was, even for the King. The sport does not care about storybook endings. It does not choreograph its final acts for maximum emotional impact. It simply unfolds, with all of its danger and unpredictability, and the men and women who participate in it accept whatever outcome the day provides. Richard Petty had accepted that truth for 35 years. and he accepted it one final time at Atlanta. On that same afternoon, a young driver from Vallejo, California, named Jeff Gordon, made his first start in the NASCAR Cup Series. The symbolism was unmistakable. As one generation exited the stage, another was entering. The past and the future, occupying the same track, on the same day, at the same moment. The sport would go on, as it always does, and the names on the entry list would change, and the cars would change, and the sponsors would change. But the foundation that Richard Petty had laid, over 3.5 decades of competition, the standard of excellence and grace and human decency that he had established, would remain as permanent as the asphalt itself. After the race, Petty climbed out of his car for the final time as a professional race car driver. He removed his helmet and set it on the roof. He reached for his cowboy hat, the hat that had become as much a part of NASCAR's visual identity as the checkered flag, or the green flag, or the roar of 40 engines at the start. He put it on, adjusting the brim with the same casual precision he had used 1,000 times before, and he walked through the garage area one last time, shaking hands, embracing friends and crew members and rivals, who had become friends, saying goodbye to the only professional life he had ever known. The tears that fell in the Atlanta garage that November afternoon were not tears of sadness alone. They were tears of gratitude and love, shed by men and women who understood that they had been privileged to share the track, the garage, and the sport with a man who was, in every meaningful sense of the word, irreplaceable. The sport would continue without Richard Petty behind the wheel, but it would never be quite the same. Some absences are simply too large to fill. Behind the sunglasses, behind the cowboy hat, behind the easy smile and the outstretched hand, there was a man who carried more pain than most people ever knew. The public saw the king. The record books recorded the victories. The television cameras captured the celebrations. But the full story of Richard Petty is not a story of triumph alone. It is a story of what it costs to be a champion, measured not in dollars or trophies, but in flesh and bone and heartbreak. It is a story of a body battered beyond what most human beings could endure, a family tested by tragedy that no amount of fame could prevent, and a spirit that somehow, against all reason and all odds, refused to break. The physical toll of a career in stock car racing is something that the casual fan rarely considers. The cars look sturdy. The drivers appear protected. The safety equipment has improved beyond recognition since the early days of the sport. But the reality of what happens inside those machines, lap after lap, race after race, year after year, is a story of relentless, cumulative punishment. The heat inside a stock car during a summer race in the American South can exceed 140 degrees Fahrenheit. The vibrations that travel through the chassis and into the driver's body are constant and unforgiving, rattling bones and loosening joints with every mile. The G-forces that a driver experiences through the turns, particularly on the high-banked superspeedways, compress the spine and strain the neck muscles with a force that would leave most people incapacitated after a single race. And all of this occurs while the driver is maintaining absolute focus, making split-second decisions at speeds approaching 200 miles per hour for 3 or 4 hours at a stretch. Richard Petty endured this punishment for 35 years, 1,184 races, hundreds of thousands of miles at race speed. The math alone is staggering, but the math does not account for the crashes. And it was the crashes that left the deepest marks on the King's body. The crash at Darlington in 1970 was among the most severe. Petty's car hit the wall at high speed, and the impact was devastating. He suffered a dislocated shoulder and was so badly shaken that he had to be helped from the wreckage. In an earlier era, the crash might have ended his career. In the era in which Petty raced, it was simply another day at the office. He recovered, he returned, and he kept racing. But Darlington was not the worst of it. Over the course of his career, Petty was involved in dozens of crashes that ranged from minor scrapes to catastrophic impacts. He broke bones. He tore ligaments. He suffered concussions that went undiagnosed, because in those days, nobody talked about concussions, and the expectation was that a driver would shake off whatever ailed him and get back in the car. He drove through pain that would have put most men in a hospital bed. He finished races with injuries that he concealed from the press, from the fans, and sometimes even from his own family. The cowboy hat and the sunglasses were not just a trademark. They were, in a way, a mask, a shield, a way of presenting the king to the world, while the man behind the image dealt with the cumulative damage of a career spent hurtling around racetracks at impossible speeds. The crash at Daytona in 1988 was perhaps the most terrifying of all. During a race at the Daytona International Speedway, Petty's car was caught in a multi-car accident on the backstretch. The car went airborne, tumbling end over end in a horrifying barrel roll that seemed to last an eternity. When the car finally came to rest, it was barely recognizable as an automobile. The roof was crushed, the doors were torn away. Pieces of the car were scattered across the track like shrapnel from an explosion. Rescue workers rushed to the wreckage, expecting the worst, but Petty was alive. He was injured, with broken bones and deep bruises that would take weeks to heal, but he was alive. The fact that he survived at all was considered miraculous by those who witnessed the crash. The fact that he returned to racing after recovering was considered either brave or foolish, depending on who you asked. But that was the code, the unwritten law of the garage. You got hurt, you healed, you got back in the car. You did not talk about the fear, because to talk about it would be to acknowledge it, and to acknowledge it would be to let it win. Richard Petty was not immune to fear. No sane person who straps into a machine traveling at 200 miles per hour is immune to fear. But he had learned, from his father and from the culture that raised him, to manage that fear, to channel it, to use it as fuel rather than allowing it to become an obstacle. The fear was always there. The courage was in choosing to race anyway. The long-term effects of all those crashes and all those years of physical punishment accumulated quietly, like interest on a debt that would eventually come due. Petty's neck and back problems became chronic as he aged, the result of countless impacts and the constant strain of fighting a steering wheel for hours at a time. His hearing was damaged by decades of exposure to engine noise at close range, in an era before drivers routinely wore earplugs or noise-cancelling equipment. His hands, the hands that had gripped the wheel through 200 victories and 1,000 defeats, bore the marks of a lifetime of labour, the fingers slightly gnarled, the joints swollen with arthritis. The body that had carried the king through 3.5 decades of competition bore its scars like a map of the places he had been and the price he had paid for going there. But the physical toll was in many ways the easier burden to bear. The body heals, bones knit, bruises fade. The emotional toll of a life in racing is a different kind of wound, one that does not always heal cleanly, and sometimes does not heal at all. At the centre of Richard Petty's emotional life was his marriage to Linda Owens. They married on June the 23rd, 1959, when Richard was just 21 years old and already beginning to make a name for himself in NASCAR's Grand National Series. Linda Petty was not a racing wife by inclination. She was a quiet private woman who valued family and stability and normalcy, all of the things that a career in professional racing tends to destroy. But she loved Richard, and she understood that racing was not something he did, it was something he was. And so she accepted the bargain that every racing wife must accept. The knowledge that every time her husband climbed into that car, there was a chance he would not climb out. For 35 years, Linda Petty watched her husband race. She sat in the stands, or waited in the hauler, or listened to the radio broadcast, and she endured the particular agony that only a racing spouse can understand, the agony of watching the person you love most in the world put himself in mortal danger, week after week, year after year, with no guarantee that today would not be the day the phone call came. She managed the household. She raised their children. She provided the anchor of stability and normalcy that allowed Richard to pursue his career with the single-minded focus that championship-level competition demands. And she did it without complaint, without public drama, without the kind of attention-seeking behavior that would have been entirely understandable given the pressures she was under. Linda Petty was, by all accounts, the quiet strength behind the king. Richard himself acknowledged this repeatedly over the years, crediting his wife with everything from keeping the family together during the long racing seasons to providing the emotional support that sustained him through the inevitable setbacks and disappointments. Their partnership was, in its quiet way, as remarkable as anything that happened on the track. It lasted for more than 60 years, enduring hardships that would have shattered most marriages. When Linda passed away on March the 14th, 2014, after a long illness, Richard Petty lost the person who had been his anchor, his confidant, and his partner through everything the sport had thrown at them. The grief was profound, and those who knew the couple understood that a part of the king died that day as well. But the cruelest blow that fate dealt the Petty family came on a May afternoon in the year 2000, at a track in Loudon, New Hampshire. It was the day that changed everything. The day that redefined the meaning of loss for a family that thought it had already experienced every form of pain that racing could inflict. Adam Petty was Richard's grandson, the son of Kyle Petty, who had followed his father into racing and competed in the Cup Series with varying degrees of success. Adam was the fourth generation of Pettys to reign NASCAR, a fact that filled the entire family with a pride that was difficult to articulate. He was 19 years old, he was talented, he was charismatic, he had the easy charm and the genuine warmth that seemed to be coded into the Petty family's DNA. Everyone who met him remarked on it. The boy had something special. He was not just carrying on the family tradition, he was breathing new life into it. On May the 12th, 2000, during a practice session at New Hampshire Motor Speedway, Adam Petty's car crashed into the Turn 3 wall at high speed. The impact was catastrophic. Adam Petty was killed instantly. He was 19 years old. He had his whole life ahead of him. He had a family that loved him, and a sport that was ready to embrace him, and a legacy that he was eager to honour and extend. And in one terrible, irreversible moment, all of it was gone. The grief that descended on the Petty family in the wake of Adam's death was overwhelming. Richard Petty, the man who had survived every crash, endured every injury, weathered every disappointment that a 35-year career could produce, was brought to his knees by the loss of his grandson. This was not a dented fender or a broken bone. This was not a lost race or a missed championship. This was the worst thing that could happen to anyone. The death of a child, a young person who represented the future and the hope and the continuation of everything the family had built. Kyle Petty, Adam's father, was devastated in ways that words cannot adequately describe. A parent's grief at the loss of a child is the deepest and most enduring form of sorrow that exists, and Kyle carried that grief with a raw honesty that was both heartbreaking and profoundly moving. He spoke openly about his pain. He wept publicly. He refused to pretend that he was all right when he was not all right. And in doing so, he gave permission to other people in the racing community, and beyond it, to acknowledge their own grief, their own vulnerability. But out of that grief, out of the darkest chapter in the Petty family's long and storied history, something extraordinary emerged. Kyle Petty, driven by the desire to honour his son's memory and to create something positive from an unimaginable loss, founded the Victory Junction Gang Camp. Named in part after Adam, the camp was built near the Petty family's home in Randleman, North Carolina, and its mission was to provide a free, life-changing experience for children with chronic or life-threatening medical conditions. The camp offered these children, many of whom had spent their young lives in and out of hospitals, the chance to experience the joys of a traditional summer camp, swimming, horseback riding, fishing, arts and crafts, in a medically supported environment where their conditions were managed with expertise and compassion. Victory Junction opened its doors in 2004, and it has served thousands of children and families in the years since. It stands as one of the most meaningful and enduring legacies of the Petty family, a testament to the idea that even the greatest loss can give rise to something beautiful if the people who suffer that loss choose to transform their grief into action. Richard Petty supported the camp wholeheartedly, lending his name, his time and his resources to the effort. For the king, who had spent his entire career giving to the fans, the camp was a natural extension of the values he had always lived by. You help people, you show up, you give what you can, and when life knocks you down, you find a way to turn your pain into someone else's joy. The transition from driver to team owner was another chapter in the Petty story that revealed the complexities of sustaining a legacy in a rapidly changing sport. Petty Enterprises, the family operation that had been the home of the King's entire career, continued to field cars after Richard's retirement, with Kyle Petty as its primary driver and Richard as the team's guiding presence. But the economics of modern NASCAR were brutal, and the family-owned team model that had carried the Pettys through decades of competition was increasingly unsustainable. The mega teams, with their multiple car operations and their deep-pocketed corporate sponsors and their state-of-the-art facilities, had fundamentally altered the competitive landscape. Teams like Hendrick Motorsports, Roush Racing, and Joe Gibbs Racing operated at a scale that Petty Enterprises simply could not match. The budgets were enormous. The technology was expensive. The talent pool for engineers, mechanics, and crew chiefs was being drained by organizations that could offer higher salaries and better resources. For a family team rooted in the traditions of an earlier era, the challenge was not just competitive, it was existential. Through the late 1990s and into the 2000s, Petty Enterprises struggled to remain competitive. The team occasionally showed flashes of its former glory, but consistent success proved elusive. Sponsor turnover, leadership changes, and the departure of key personnel created an atmosphere of instability that was painful for those who remembered the days when the Petty name was synonymous with winning. Richard Petty, ever the optimist, continued to believe that the team could find its way back to the front. But the gap between belief and reality grew wider with each passing season. In 2008, facing the harsh financial realities of the modern sport, Petty Enterprises merged with Gillette Evernham Motorsports to form a new entity called Richard Petty Motorsports. The merger was a practical necessity, a way to pool resources and share costs in an environment that had become prohibitively expensive for independent operations. But for many longtime fans and observers of the sport, the merger marked the end of an era. Petty Enterprises, the team that Lee Petty had founded in a small garage in Level Cross, the team that Richard had driven to 200 victories and 7 championships, the team that had been a family operation in the truest and most literal sense of the word, was gone. Its name survived in the new organization, but its identity, its culture, its essence had been fundamentally altered. Richard Petty Motorsports has continued to compete in the Cup Series, with varying degrees of success. The team has had some notable moments, including strong performances by drivers such as Marcos Ambrose and Aric Almirola, but it has never recaptured the consistent dominance that defined the Petty Enterprises era. The sport has simply moved too far beyond the reach of a team operating at that scale. The King remains involved, attending races, meeting with sponsors, offering guidance and support, but there is a bittersweet quality to his presence. The sense of a man watching a world that he helped create continue to evolve in ways that he cannot always control or influence. In 2014, Richard Petty received the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor, from President Barack Obama. The ceremony at the White House was a moment of profound recognition, an acknowledgement that Petty's contributions to American culture extended far beyond the boundaries of motorsport. He was being honored not just for winning 200 races, but for the way he had conducted himself throughout a career and a life that had touched millions of people. The Medal of Freedom is awarded to individuals who have made especially meritorious contributions to the security or national interests of the United States, to world peace, or to cultural or other significant public or private endeavors. That Richard Petty, a stock car driver from a tiny town in North Carolina, was included in the ranks of Medal of Freedom recipients alongside scientists, statesmen, artists, and humanitarians spoke volumes about the impact he had made. Petty accepted the medal with his characteristic grace and humility. He wore his cowboy hat to the White House, because, of course, he did. He smiled for the cameras, he shook the president's hand, and then he went home to Level Cross, to the same community where he had grown up, to the same family that had sustained him through everything, and he carried on, because that is what the King had always done. He carried on, through victories and defeats, through glory and grief, through the highs of a career that produced numbers so extraordinary. They sound like fiction, and the lows of losses so devastating they defy comprehension, Richard Petty carried on. The deeper truth of Richard Petty's story is not found in the record books or the trophy cases. It is found in the scars, both visible and invisible, that he carries. It is found in the way he responded to adversity, not with bitterness or self-pity, but with resilience and grace. It is found in the relationships he built and maintained, with his wife, with his children and grandchildren, with the thousands of fans who considered him a friend, even if they had only met him once. It is found in Victory Junction, in the laughter of children who might never have known the joy of a summer camp if a family had not chosen to transform its deepest grief into its greatest gift. The numbers are staggering: 200 wins, 7 championships, 7 Daytona 500 victories. But behind every one of those numbers is a human being who bled, who hurt, who grieved, who loved, who gave, and who endured. The stats tell you what Richard Petty did. The story behind the stats tells you who he was. And who he was, in the end, is far more remarkable than what he accomplished. What does it mean to be the king? It is a question that sounds simple, but contains more weight than 1,000 trophies. A king is not merely the best. A king is the one who defines the standard by which all others are measured. A king is the one whose name becomes inseparable from the thing he ruled. And in the world of American stock car racing, there has only ever been one king. Richard Petty did not just dominate NASCAR, he defined it. He was the sport during the years when the sport found its identity. He was the face that smiled from the posters and the magazine covers and the television screens. He was the voice that answered the reporters' questions with a warmth and a wit that made the sport accessible to people who had never set foot inside a racetrack. He was the handshake that greeted the first-time fan, the autograph that hung on a child's bedroom wall, the story that a grandfather told his grandson about the time he saw the king race at Daytona. The era that Richard Petty represented was an era of transformation. When he began racing in the late 1950s, NASCAR was a regional sport with a small following, largely confined to the southeastern United States. By the time he retired in 1992, it was a national phenomenon with television contracts, corporate sponsors, and a fan base that stretched from coast to coast. Petty did not accomplish this transformation alone. There were many men and women who contributed to the growth of the sport, from team owners and track promoters to television executives and marketing professionals. But if you had to choose a single person who was most responsible for taking NASCAR from the dirt tracks of the Piedmont to the national stage, that person would be Richard Petty, not because of a strategic plan or a marketing campaign, but because of who he was. There is a philosophical question embedded in the story of the king that deserves consideration. What is the relationship between a champion and the people who follow him? Is a champion merely the best performer in a given field? Or is a champion something more, something that transcends statistics and records and becomes a kind of cultural force? Richard Petty's 200 victories are extraordinary. His 7 championships are extraordinary. But what is truly extraordinary is the fact that, more than 3 decades after his last race, he remains the most beloved figure in the history of American motorsport. That kind of enduring love is not earned through performance alone. It is earned through character. Consider the nature of records in sport. Records are, by their nature, temporary. They exist to be broken. Babe Ruth's home run record fell to Hank Aaron. Wilt Chamberlain's scoring records have been challenged and in some cases surpassed. Wayne Gretzky's career points total stands as the most unbreakable record in professional hockey, but even that number will eventually be approached by some extraordinary talent born in a future generation. Records are milestones on a road that has no end. Each one stands for a time, and then the road extends further, and a new milestone takes its place. But Richard Petty's 200 wins occupy a unique position in the landscape of sporting records. The record is not merely impressive, it is structurally unreachable. The modern NASCAR schedule includes approximately 36 races per season. To match Petty's total, a driver would need to win an average of 5 or 6 races per year for more than 30 consecutive seasons, a feat of consistency and longevity that defies any reasonable projection. The most prolific winners of the modern era, Jeff Gordon with 93 victories, Jimmy Johnson with 83, have fallen short by margins so large that the comparison itself feels absurd. Kyle Busch, one of the most talented and aggressive drivers of his generation, has accumulated victories at an impressive rate, but even his most optimistic supporters do not seriously suggest that 200 is within reach. The record does not loom over the sport. It presides over it, serene and untroubled, like a mountain that climbers can admire but never summit. The sport that Petty left behind when he retired has continued to evolve, sometimes in directions that the king might not have anticipated. The cars have changed dramatically, transitioning from the stock-bodied machines of the early years to the purpose-built race cars of today, vehicles that share little more than a name and a general shape with the automobiles that ordinary people drive on public roads. The tracks have changed as well, with the addition of road courses and street circuits to a schedule that was once dominated by oval speedways. The business model has undergone a revolution, with the introduction of the charter system, which assigns franchise-like values to team entries, and the negotiation of television contracts worth billions of dollars that would have seemed like fantasy to the promoters of Petty's era. The drivers who compete today are athletes in a way that the drivers of Petty's era were not, trained in fitness regimens and mental performance techniques that would have seemed foreign to the men who raced in the 1960s and 70s. They have nutritionists and personal trainers and sports psychologists. They use simulators to learn new tracks and refine their techniques before they ever turn a wheel in anger. They are corporate ambassadors as much as they are racers, their personal brands carefully managed by teams of publicists and marketing professionals. The speeds are higher, the technology is more sophisticated, the money is bigger. Everything about modern NASCAR would be almost unrecognizable to a fan transported from the 1967 season. And yet something essential remains: the bond between the driver and the fan. The thrill of watching machines push the limits of speed and control. The drama of a close finish, the heartbreak of a late race crash, the joy of a victory earned through skill and courage and determination. These things have not changed. They are the same today as they were when Richard Petty crossed the finish line at Daytona for the first time in 1964. And in a way, every time a modern driver pulls into victory lane and waves to the crowd, they are doing something that the king helped invent. They are connecting with the people who made it all possible. The loss of the family team era is something that many longtime fans mourn. The days when Petty enterprises could compete with the best in the sport, using little more than talent, ingenuity, and family loyalty, are gone. The modern Cup Series is dominated by multi-car organizations with budgets that dwarf anything the Pettys could have imagined. The garage area at a modern race looks more like a technology campus than a workshop, and the intimacy that once characterized the sport, the feeling that the drivers and the fans were part of the same community, has been diluted by the sheer scale of the modern enterprise. But Richard Petty himself remains a bridge between the old world and the new. He still attends races, he still meets fans, he still wears the cowboy hat and the sunglasses, those twin symbols that have become as recognizable as any logo in American sport. He still shakes hands and signs autographs, though the hand is older now and the lines on his face are deeper, carved by time and grief and the accumulated weight of a life lived in the public eye. When he walks through the garage area, the young drivers look at him with a respect that borders on awe. They may never have seen him race. They may know his record only from the history books and the grainy footage on streaming platforms. But they know what he means. They know what he represents. He is the living proof that it is possible to be the best in the world and still be a decent human being. That excellence and humility are not mutually exclusive. That greatness, true greatness, is measured not in victories alone, but in the way those victories are won and the way the victor conducts himself when the cameras are off and the crowds have gone home. There is a melancholy in the story of the king, as there is in all stories of greatness that has passed. The world moves on. The records are challenged, even if they remain unbroken. The memories fade. Young fans who discover NASCAR today may never fully understand what Richard Petty meant to the sport and to the people who loved it. They may see the number 200 and think it is just a number. They may see the cowboy hat and think it is just an accessory. They may hear the name and think it is just a name, like any other name in the long list of champions and former champions who populate the archives of professional sport. But for those who were there, for those who stood in line for hours to shake the king's hand, for those who watched the petty blue number 43 fly around the track on a Sunday afternoon, with the sun burning through the haze and the crowd roaring and the air thick with the intoxicating cocktail of exhaust fumes and possibility, for those who grew up with the sound of Richard Petty's name as a kind of background music to their lives, the legacy is not something that can be diminished by time. It is permanent, it is woven into the fabric of the sport itself, and it will remain there, a constant thread in the tapestry of American racing, for as long as men and women strap themselves into stock cars and chase each other around a track at speeds that would terrify any rational person. The story of Richard Petty is, in the end, a story about what one person can mean to an entire community. Not a neighbourhood or a town, though he meant the world to level cross, but a community in the broader sense, the community of people who love stock car racing, who find meaning and joy and fellowship in the roar of the engines and the smell of burning rubber and the sight of brightly painted machines hurling themselves around a track. Richard Petty gave that community its identity. He gave it its finest ambassador. He gave it a standard of excellence and humanity that will endure long after the last person who saw him race has gone. The King is not just a chapter in the history of NASCAR. He is the foundation upon which the rest of the story is built. And foundations, by their nature, endure. In the end, what is left is not the metal of the trophies or the ink of the record books. What is left is the feeling of standing at a racetrack on a warm Sunday afternoon, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and hot asphalt, the grandstands full of people who have come not just to watch a race, but to be part of something larger than themselves. The feeling of seeing the number 43 roll past, painted in that unmistakable shade of blue, and knowing that the man behind the wheel is not just a driver but a symbol of everything the sport is supposed to be. Richard Petty gave stock car racing its soul. He gave it a face and a voice and a handshake. He gave it a standard of conduct that every driver who followed him has been measured against, whether they knew it or not. He showed the world that you could be fierce on the track and gentle off it, that you could drive with the aggression of a warrior and carry yourself with the grace of a gentleman, that you could win 200 races and still find time to sign one more autograph for a kid who had been waiting in line since morning. There are those who will argue about the numbers. There are those who will point out that the competition was different in Petty's era, that the fields were smaller, that the schedules were longer, that the sport's talent pool was shallower than it would become in later decades. These are fair observations, and they deserve honest consideration. But they miss the essential point. Richard Petty did not simply accumulate victories in a vacuum. He accumulated them against the best drivers of his generation. Men like David Pearson and Cale Yarborough, and Bobby Allison and Bobby Isaac and Buddy Baker, men who were every bit as talented and every bit as hungry as any driver who has competed since. He accumulated them on tracks that were more dangerous, in cars that were less safe, under conditions that would be considered intolerable by the standards of the modern sport. He did not win 200 races because the competition was weak. He won 200 races because he was extraordinary. And he was extraordinary not just behind the wheel. He was extraordinary in the way he understood the unspoken contract between a champion and the people who cheer for him. Every sport has its superstars. Every generation produces athletes whose physical gifts set them apart from their peers. But the athletes who truly matter, the ones whose names transcend their era and their sport, and enter the broader cultural conversation, are the ones who understand that their talent comes with a responsibility to represent something larger than themselves, a responsibility to treat the people who support them with dignity and respect, a responsibility to leave their sport and their community better than they found it. Richard Petty understood this responsibility intuitively. He did not learn it from a management consultant or a public relations firm. He learned it from his parents, from the culture that raised him, from the small-town values of Level Cross, North Carolina, where a man's word was his bond and a handshake was as binding as any contract. He learned it from watching the way his father treated the fans, and the fellow drivers, and the track officials, and the mechanics who worked on the cars. He learned it by growing up in a world where respect was not given freely, but had to be earned through honest effort and consistent conduct. And he practiced it every single day of his racing career, not because it was strategic, not because it was good for business, but because it was who he was. The autograph sessions that lasted for hours after every race were not a marketing exercise. They were an expression of gratitude. The conversations with the fans, the questions about their families, the genuine interest in their lives and their stories were not performative acts designed to build a brand. They were the natural behavior of a man who understood that without those fans, the cars were just machines, and the tracks were just asphalt, and the trophies were just metal. This is the legacy that matters most. Not the 200 wins, though they are magnificent. Not the 7 championships, though they are historic. Not the 7 Daytona 500 victories, though they are unmatched. Not the 27 wins in 1967, though they are almost incomprehensible. Not the 10 consecutive victories, though they represent a streak of dominance that defies explanation. The legacy that matters most is the example. The proof, written in decades of consistent behavior, that it is possible to compete at the highest level of a dangerous, demanding, unforgiving sport and still be a good person. That winning does not require cruelty. That strength does not require arrogance. That greatness does not require the sacrifice of basic human decency. In a world that often seems to reward the loudest voice and the most aggressive posture, Richard Petty stands as a quiet counter-argument. He is the evidence that there is another way, a better way, a way that leaves behind not just records and trophies, but friendships and gratitude, and the enduring affection of millions of people who never knew him personally but felt, in some deep and authentic way, that he was their champion, their king. 200 wins, 7 championships, 7 Daytona 500 victories, 27 wins in a single season, 10 consecutive victories. 1,184 career starts across 35 seasons. A career that began when Dwight Eisenhower was president and ended when Bill Clinton was about to enter the White House. A career that spanned the entirety of stock car racing's transformation from a regional pastime to a global industry. A career that produced more joy, more excitement, more shared experience, and more unforgettable moments than any single career in the history of American motorsport. These are monuments. They stand like pillars in the cathedral of American sport, each one a testament to a level of sustained excellence that may never be matched. But they are not the whole story. They are not even the most important part of the story. The most important part of the story is the man who earned those numbers. The man who grew up in a small garage in Level Cross, North Carolina, learning from his father how to build an engine and how to live a life. The man who climbed into a race car for the first time as a nervous young man of 21 and did not climb out for the last time until he was 55. The man who carried the weight of a family legacy, the pressure of public expectation, the pain of physical injury, and the grief of unimaginable loss, and who somehow managed to carry all of it without losing the essential quality that made him who he was. His kindness, his warmth, his genuine unshakable love for the people who supported him. In a sport defined by speed, Richard Petty's greatest gift was his willingness to slow down, to stop, to linger, to give each person he met the feeling that they were seen, that they mattered, that their love for the sport was not taken for granted. In a world that moves faster every year, that gift feels more precious now than it ever did. The cars will keep racing, the records will keep standing, or perhaps one distant day they will fall. Perhaps 200 wins will endure forever, a monument so tall that no one will ever build anything beside it. Or perhaps some driver in some future generation, possessed of talent and longevity and fortune in equal and extraordinary measure, will approach that number and give the sport one more reason to remember the king. But whether the records stand or fall, the legacy of Richard Petty will endure, not because of the numbers, because of the man, Richard Lee Petty, the kid from Level Cross, the son of a champion, the father of a racer, the grandfather of a boy who was taken too soon, The husband of a woman who loved him through 1,000 races and worried through every one. The driver of the Petty Blue number 43. The man with the cowboy hat and the sunglasses and the smile that could light up a grandstand. The handshake that never grew tired. The autograph that was never refused. The king who wore his crown so lightly that it never seemed to weigh him down at all. They called him the king, and there will never be another.